Everyone. Today we're going to begin Chapter 14. We're going to cover money, banks, and the Federal Reserve System. So for this chapter, first we're going to begin with talking about what is money, where does money come from, how does it develop, and how do societies begin to use currency. Then we're going to move on to how money is measured in the United States. After that, we'll talk about the banking system, how banks create money through their regular activities. And it's going to highlight the importance of the banking system when we're trying to, smooth out fluctuations in the business cycle. Speaking of smoothing out fluctuations in the business cycle, after we talk about how banks create money, we'll talk about the Federal Reserve System, how the Federal Reserve System is set up, and the tools that they use, and how they use the banking system in order to influence the business cycle. And then we'll end with a brief talk about the quantity theory of money, which is an important concept to understand coming out of a Principles of Macroeconomics course. So, what is money? The great Austrian economist Karl Menger asked, why is everyone willing to trade useful goods and services, all these things that we do and all this time and labor and effort we put into creating these things? Why are we willing to trade them for mere tokens, things that aren't even useful? Here on the bottom of the slide, we see different types of money throughout time. So first we have the currency, old shells that were used. And some societies use those as currency. Next we had pieces of iron, which were also used as currency. Moving forward in time, next we see a coin with an owl on it. Looks like a silver coin. This was, I believe, from somewhere in ancient Greece. And finally we end with what we know of today as currency, the US dollar. Of course, I'm going to say this as an economist, but money is one of mankind's most important inventions. It revolutionized the world and allowed economic growth and the increase in living standards that we've seen today. So economists consider money to be any sort of asset that people are generally willing to accept in exchange for goods and services or for the payment of debts. These are things may not be of value anymore, although we'll talk about how they used to be of value, have intrinsic value themselves, but people are willing to trade them for other goods and services. So you're more than happy to accept money from your job because you know you can turn around and spend that money on other things you need. And the person you trade with is willing to accept that money because, again, they can turn around and use that money to buy the goods and services that they need. So we're going to begin by considering the role that money serves, what can be used as money, and the history of what has been used of money over time. Then we're going to talk about modern forms of money and how important banks are and the role banks have in creating the money supply and how the government manages the money supply in a country. So why do we need money? Where does money come from? So let's suppose you're living before money was invented. So there's no concept of currency in this small society you live in. If you want to trade, you're going to have to barter. So you're going to have to trade that good and service directly for the good or service that you want. Now there's a problem with this, and it's called the double coincidence of wants. Not only do you need to find someone who has the good or the service that you want, they have to want the good or the service that you have. So this can be a very long and time-consuming process. Eventually, society started using commodity money. So these were goods that are used like money because they have value independent of their use as money. So things like animal skins or precious metals. Because they have a use outside of this, and a lot of people had uses for those goods, people could use them as currency. People were willing to accept those. Now, over time, this began, the use of commodity money, with people trading for several different types of commodities that were widely used. Over time, societies are going to converge to the best one. Karl Menger described this process, so we call it Mengerian convergence, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. So imagine yourself at like a medieval trading fair. There's no currency involved here. People show up just with the goods or the services that they produce. So let's say that you're an asparagus farmer. You chose to be an asparagus farmer because, it's easy to buy asparagus seeds for you. It's cheap. The land is very good to grow asparagus. The only problem is not a ton of people like asparagus. So let's say you go to this fair and you want to buy a shirt. So you look around for people that sell flannel shirts and you find a few people, but none of them want to buy asparagus. None of the people that sell those shirts, make those shirts and are willing to trade them, actually want asparagus. So you may think, all right, I'm out of luck. What am I going to do? I can't find someone who wants what I have to trade and who has what I want. So what people started to figure out is, okay, they asked the person with shirts, well, what do you want? A lot of times that person would say salt. Salt was, heavily used in the past. It was one of the few spices, across the world. So people began trading. You think to yourself, all right, I'll trade my asparagus for salt because a lot of people out there have salt. So you find someone who actually wants asparagus and has salt. You then take that salt and trade that for the shirt that you want. Now, this isn't a top-down process. This is what we call bottom-up process, or spontaneous order. Individuals acting in their own self-interest, not concerned about what other people are doing or not planning this with other people, not talking to other people about it, but just trying to make their lives easier. They end up converging towards one standard unit. So what are some of the implications of Karl Menger's theory, his theory of monetary convergence? The first is the invisible hand. Like Adam Smith uses this as a metaphor for the market, that incentives guides people towards equilibrium as if there is an invisible hand pushing them towards it. There was no collective decision making necessary. These developed over time as people were trying to do what was best for them. Now, the first money was commodity money. So it was money that had value independent of its use as currency, which again is very important considering current currency, stuff we use today, are called fiat currency. They're not backed by anything of value, but originally they were valuable. Now, money's core role is a commonly accepted medium of exchange. So currency is used in trades rather than trading for goods directly. But there are some secondary roles, and we're going to talk about these in a minute: the store of value and the unit of account. Now, money is essential. Some sort of currency is essential for people in an economy to be able to specialize. Without currency, people are going to have to pretty much make everything themselves that they're going to consume because trade is just so difficult. Once people begin using currency, that facilitates trade. It makes it so much easier. So people are able to specialize in one thing, whether it's being a farmer, whether it's sewing shirts, whether it's being an accountant, or whether it's working in healthcare. Specializing in these things would be impossible, or virtually impossible, without currency. And it's important to note that specialization, people focusing on one job and becoming very productive at that, and then trading away their excess for the other goods and services they need, did not precede monetary exchange, but the invention of money happened at the same time as specialization. So these were occurring at the same time. The money has four primary functions, and the first and most important is a medium of exchange. So you can use money to buy goods and services. It is widely accepted, and it's how people engage in trade. Next is the unit of account. Money allows a way of measuring value in a standardized manner. Rather than having the price of a good or a service be listed in all the other goods and services that are produced in an economy, instead you just list it in terms of that currency. So we list prices in US dollars, and everyone easily knows how much that costs, and you can compare the value of different goods and services because we have that standard unit of account across all the goods and services being sold in an economy. It also allows firms the ability to gauge whether they're earning a profit or a loss, so they can judge their costs relative to their revenues, so they know if they're actually providing something of value to people, or if consumers don't want what they're selling. Next, money is a store of value. So people are able to defer consumption until a later date because this money holds its value over time. In the past, if you lived on a farm and you grew the crops are going to rot. They're going to go bad at some point. So you can't keep this value over time. Eventually, and fairly soon for some crops, the value of them are going to drop to zero. So you would have to consume them or trade them almost immediately. With money, you can sell them and hold that money and delay your consumption until the future when you really need it. Now, other assets are also a store of value. Things like stocks and bonds maintain their value over time. Things like Rembrandt paintings, housing, all these things maintain their value, but they're not very liquid. You can't easily exchange them for goods. You need to convert those other assets into currency and then use the currency to buy goods and services. And finally, money is a standard of deferred payment. So money facilitates exchanges across time. What I mean by exchanges across time is borrowing and lending. So it allows you to be able to borrow to purchase a house, purchase a car, to go to college. This is possible because its value in the future, the currency's value in the future, is predictable. Even when there's inflation, we can generally judge how the price level is going to change and make, if not perfect, at least decent estimations of that. So we still are able to borrow and lend for the future. All right, so now that we talked about the uses of money, what can actually serve as money? So in order for something to be an accepted medium of exchange, so, potential money, a good should have the following characteristics. First is it should be widely accepted. You want it to be widely accepted so it can be used in a ton of transactions. Right now, no one accepts Bitcoin besides some nerds and a few food trucks in DC. So it's not a very good currency because not very many people accept it. It's going to be very difficult to find someone who's going to accept Bitcoin as payment. So you might as well be trying to trade, a table or a chicken for that good or service because it's so difficult to find someone who actually wants Bitcoin. So for money to be useful, it has to be widely accepted by a lot of people. So it makes transactions easy because that's the whole point of money. It should also be a standardized quality. So any two units are going to be alike. It might be difficult for us to imagine because we typically use dollar bills, which, by definition are alike. But this really is important when we're talking about commodity money, like old gold coins or silver coins. It was important that they be of the same size, the same fineness, the same percentage of the actual precious metal, so that they were all coins are going to be the same value. Again, just to make transactions easier, so you don't have to determine the value of each coin. Money should also be durable, so that its value isn't lost by storage over time. Because again, you want to have the store of value. You want it to be able to hold its value over a long period of time, so you can defer your consumption until later. Money should also be valuable relative to its weight, so it can be easily transported, even in very large quantities. So that way, again, it's easy to make these purchases. Before Sweden began more international trade, this is, in the early Middle Ages, their currency was copper coins. They were on the copper standard. But copper isn't relatively valuable relative to its weight. So what they had to do was, even for normal transactions, they would have to pay strong young men to carry around these giant copper coins. That's basically like the weights you would throw on a barbell at the gym. They're enormous, they were very large, heavy, difficult to move around. Once Sweden began trading and enough silver currency got into the country, they switched over to a silver standard because it was much more valuable relative to its weight. So it was easy to carry around. You don't have to literally pay someone to carry your money around for you. And finally, it should be divisible. So you want a lot of different denominations of that currency. That's why we go all the way from the penny and small change all the way up to $100 bills. So now commodity money, like I mentioned, has value independent of its use as money. So it has uses besides just being used in exchange. And that's why these early societies converged on commodity money, because it was something that was useful that people all across the economy were willing to use and to accept. So over time, there have been a lot of different types of commodity money. So in China, they use cowrie shells. Throughout the world, they use precious metals, and this lasted up until the Great Depression, and even the U.S. dollar was still backed by gold until about 1970. In colonial North America, they use beaver pelts, deer pelts. I think it was the governor of the Tennessee Territory, the original governor, was paid in deer pelts rather than precious metals or paper currency. Native Americans used wampum shells and beads. And in prisoner of war camps in World War II, cigarettes were used as currency. People went from using commodity money to using paper money to using fiat money. So I'll describe this process here and try to keep it fairly brief. I took a whole class in grad school focusing just on the theory of money, and I think half of the class was describing the process from commodity money, how commodity money functioned, moving to paper money that was backed by commodity money, and then moving to the current fiat currency we have. So basically, early on, we had gold coins and silver coins. That was the currency. But there's problems using that. People could steal it from you. They were still fairly heavy to lug around. It's not like pants had pockets back then, so you had to carry around sacks full of coins. So people normally keep them in banks, keep them protected somewhere. So they could, when they wanted to make a transaction, they could either go to the bank, take out their coins, give them to the person they were transacting with, and then that person could go back to the bank and deposit it. Or they could save a step and just both go to the bank. They both go to the bank. The person that's making the purchase just signs over the gold to the person they're transacting with, and the person at the bank just goes from one account and puts the gold in the other. From there, banks began issuing basically like blank checks. So they would have a piece of paper. The person would sign and say, "I'm going to pay this person, I don't know, 40 pounds sterling." They would hand it to the bank, and the bank would move it in from one account to the other. Then, after that, they began using paper currency to represent the amount of gold that it was backed by. So what you would do is whoever had that currency, you didn't have to sign it over to anyone like a check. It was like a normal dollar bill that we have now, except it was backed by gold or silver. So what you would do is whoever had that could go to the bank and present it and get the silver or the gold that it was backed by. But because it was backed by the commodity money, people were willing to spend it rather than transacting the gold all the time because it was backed by the gold. Now, in modern times, our paper currency isn't backed by some sort of precious commodity. It's not backed by gold or silver. What we do is typically central banks, sometimes a government agency, a different government agency, issues these paper currencies that are not backed by anything. That's what fiat means, not backed by any precious metal. The United States left the gold standard in the early 1930s, the beginning of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's term during the Great Depression. Before that, you could go to any Federal Reserve Bank or the United States Treasury and give them the paper currency, and they would give you that value's worth of gold. So here's the difference between previous dollar bills and current dollar bills. And this is the $100 bill. In the past, it said this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. And by lawful money, what they meant was gold bullion, gold coins. At the bottom of the bill, it said pay to the bearer on demand $100. So whoever was in possession of that $100 bill could turn it into the Federal Reserve and get that much gold. Now the dollar bills say this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And rather than pay to the bearer $100, it just says $100. So it's not backed by any gold. There's no commodity of value that the dollar bill is tied to. The reason it keeps circulating is that people are still willing to accept it. Because people are still willing to accept the dollar bills, they still have value. So they still circulate and trade. Fiat money has advantages and has disadvantages. So the advantage of fiat money is that governments do not have to be willing to exchange it for gold or some other commodity on demand. What that means is the money supply is not tied to the amount of gold or the amount of silver in existence. So banks are much more flexible in creating money. Central banks are more flexible in creating money, It allows them to respond to fluctuations in demand for money much more rapidly. But there's also a problem with fiat currency. It's only accepted as long as households and firms have confidence that if they accept those paper bills in exchange for goods and services, those bills won't lose much value during the time, and they'll be willing to turn around and spend them on goods and services. If people stop believing in the money, it'll cease to be useful. Now, this may sound kind of far-fetched, but this is something that happens on a fairly regular basis in the world, but not the United States, thankfully. So when countries are undergoing hyperinflation, which is an extremely high inflation rate, people lose belief, they lose confidence in the currency. So, for instance, I think one of the best examples that's stuck in our mind, at least in the Western world, is the Weimar Republic, where you had people in Germany in the 1920s walking around with wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks. Because the inflation rate was so high, people would get paid, tens of thousands of Reichsmarks per day, but they could buy very little with it. And the value was falling so rapidly. The second they would get paid, they would run to a store, they would buy everything that they could while the currency still had, some value. And then they would have to trade and they would barter with each other. At one point, the bills became so um, of so low value that they would burn, tens of thousands or millions of Reichsmarks because that was cheaper than using that to buy firewood. In those situations, when there's hyperinflation, which occurs across the world to this day, Zimbabwe was just in a hyperinflation not too long ago. Venezuela is in the midst of a hyperinflation. What people tend to do is eventually stop using that currency once it reaches a certain level of inflation, and they switch to some alternate currency. Sometimes the government actually replaces it with a different stable currency, which they try to tie to another country's stable currency. Sometimes they just start using US dollars. So when a lot of Central American countries hyperinflate, they tend to what's called dollarize, where all transactions occur in US dollars instead of the local currency. All right, so now that we talked about what money is, what purposes money serve, and gave a brief history of monetary convergence, how is money measured in the United States today? So we'll briefly turn to this in this next section, which is only a few slides. If you wanted to know how much money there was in America, that's a fairly difficult question to answer until we define what money actually is. So there's two main definitions of money. These are the only two we're going to work with in this class, but there are some broader definitions of money. The first is M1. This is the most narrow definition of the money supply. M1 is just the sum of currency that's currently circulating, checking accounts that are deposited in banks, and the holding of traveler's checks. Now, some of you may remember traveler's checks. They're much less common now than they were in the past. So we're going to basically ignore traveler's checks in our discussion of M1, and we'll focus on currency in circulation and checking accounts. Now, checking accounts are by far the most important part of M1. And the reason why it's the most important part is that about 60% of cash is currently outside of the United States, being held by foreign governments or by foreign citizens. And something like 80% of the $100 bills that are printed are used outside the United States. Again, often held by foreign countries and banks, because oil transactions are priced in US dollars. A lot of international trade is done and settled using US dollars. And US dollars are held in reserve by foreign governments, again, using them for like international transactions or to use as like a safe asset to hold. Former French President Charles de Gaulle called this exorbitant privilege. The fact that the US dollar is used as the reserve currency of the world. And it does have some benefits for the United States. We have lower interest rates in the United States relative to what it would be without the US dollar being used so much for purchases in international trade. But all that aside, currency in circulation is less important than checking deposits or checking accounts being deposited in banks. So that's why banks have such an important role in the money creation process, which we'll explore later. The next type of money is M2. So this is a broader definition. So this includes everything in M1. So it includes currency and checking deposits and traveler's checks. It also includes savings account deposits, small denomination time deposits and certificates of deposit, balances in money market deposit accounts, and non-institutional money market fund shares. Now, I'm not going to waste your time defining non-institutional money market fund shares and things like that. That's not what's important from here. What I want you to take away is that M2 is a broader definition of money, and these are less liquid. So while you can spend currency in circulation and the checking deposits immediately, for savings accounts, these become less liquid, that you can't just write a check for it. You have to go there and withdraw the currency from there and then spend it. Likewise, these small denomination time deposits, money market deposit accounts, these other types of assets being counted in M2, you have to convert to cash first, and then you can spend them. So M2 is broader and it's less liquid. Chart just compares M1 to M2. So M1 you can see is basically just checking account deposits and currency. But remember, a lot of that currency is held outside the United States. So for the money supply, the M1 in the United States, the currency is even smaller. And for M2, we see M2 is much larger. Instead of 3 trillion, it's about 12 trillion. And that includes a lot of savings accounts. Savings accounts and M1 make up probably about 85% of M2. So when we talk about money supply, which definition should we use? M1 or M2? Which is better? Well, either one could be valid, but what we're working with in this chapter is money as a medium of exchange. So we're going to use M1. We're going to use checking deposits, checking account deposits in banks, and currency that can be spent. That's what's really important here. Savings accounts, these other things that are less liquid, aren't going to be useful for us for the role we're looking at for money. If we want to look at money's role as a store of value, something that can be used to make purchases later, then we'd want to consider M2. But for our purposes, M1 is what we want to go with. The debit cards directly access checking accounts. So the card for a debit card isn't money, but the checking account balance is. So debit cards, count as part of M1. Just because think of it as another way to write a check. You're drawing upon the same amount of money deposited at a bank. Credit cards don't count as part of M1. Credit cards are great. They're a really convenient way to be able to spend. You're basically just getting a short-term loan from the bank that issues a credit card. But transactions aren't complete until you pay off the loan. So because this is a loan, it doesn't represent money. So it's not going to count as part of the money supply. So your debit card tied to your checking account, that is going to be part of M1. Think of it as part of M1 just like a check is tied to your checking account. But credit cards are not tied to an account, so they're not going to have any effect on M1. So because there's more money that's held in checking accounts than there is currency in the economy, banks play a critical role in the money supply. And money is actually being created by banks. Banks take deposits and then they lend out that money. And through the lending process, they end up actually creating currency, which is what we're going to talk about in this section. Remember, banks are for-profit making firms. So just like a department store or like a restaurant, banks are trying to make a profit. Now, some banks are very small and just have a couple branches. Some banks are extremely large and are spread across the entire country. There's a wide difference between banks. So the activities of banks are designed so that they can make a profit. But at the same time, they provide valuable services to people in the economy. So basically, we're going to go through how a bank operates as a business. We're going to go through some of their financial statements. Again, this is not something that I want you to memorize how these financial statements work. But basically, I want you to understand, and this is a process to see how making loans ends up increasing the money supply. Here's the balance sheet of a typical bank, and we're going to be looking at a large bank for this example. So on the left side is going to be their assets. So first is reserves. So this is the amount of money they keep on hand. When you make a deposit in a bank, they don't keep all your cash on hand. They keep only a certain percentage, and they lend the rest of it out. That's the way that banks actually make a profit and are able to afford to keep your money on hand without actually charging you for it. Other type of assets are loans. This is very simply the money that banks lend out to people that are going to be repaid. That's why they're an asset, because they're going to be making money off of it. Next are securities. Often banks invest in some sort of securities, so things like stocks and bonds. They also have some assets like buildings and equipment, just the value of the property they own. And then there's some other miscellaneous assets. On the right side are their liabilities and the stockholders' equity in the bank. So you have deposits. These are liabilities because these must be paid by the bank. Deposits are what banks owe you if you're a depositor. There's also short-term borrowing that the bank engages in that they're going to have to pay back. And then there's longer-term debt that the bank has. And then there's some other liabilities that are just miscellaneous due to the operation of any business. So banks, basically what they do is they use the money deposited with them to make loans and to buy securities. So these investments are how they actually generate a profit. Because again, when you have a checking account or a savings account at the bank, you don't have to pay them to store it like you would like a security deposit box. And the reason you don't pay them for that, and why they actually pay you for a savings account, is that they use that money to lend out, so they're able to make a profit off it. The largest liabilities for banks are the deposit accounts, so the money that they actually owe back to their depositors. The reserves are deposits that a bank has retained rather than loaned out or invested. The reason why banks keep reserves is because they need a certain amount of money in case unexpected expenses come up, or in case there's a sudden increase in people coming to the bank to try to get money out of their account. Banks can either keep reserves physically within the bank, like in their vault, or they can keep it on deposit with the Federal Reserve. Currently, banks are required by law to keep 10% reserves. So whatever the value of the checking account deposits are, they have to keep 10% of that on hand or at the Federal Reserve at all times. So that way, if more people come to take money out of the bank than expected, they'll have that currency to cover it, so people are able to get their money. And it's important to notice that the bank does not keep enough deposits on hand to cover all of the deposits. This is called fractional reserve banking, where the banks are only required and only keep a fraction of the deposits on hand to pay back to depositors. And this is exactly how banks, this is their business model, it's how they make a profit. They lend out or they invest the money that's deposited with it. Required reserve ratio in the United States is currently 10%. So that's the minimum fraction of deposits that banks are required by law to keep as reserves on hand. Now, some banks choose to hold excess reserves. So these are reserves that banks hold above and beyond the legal requirement. Typically, excess reserves were small throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. But after the financial crisis in 2008, the Federal Reserve began paying interest on excess reserves in order to encourage banks to keep more cash on hand so they'd be safe in the event of a run on those banks. And by run on the bank, I mean basically like the scene towards the beginning of It's a Wonderful Life, where a ton of people run up to the discount window at the same time and try to get their deposits out. So now let's get into the money creation process of a bank. To illustrate this, we're going to use what we call a T account. And this is a very simplified version of a bank's balance sheet. And it's only going to show how a transaction changes the bank's balance sheet. So we're going to have on the asset side reserves, and on the deposit side liabilities to start out. So initially, let's say you deposit $1,000 at Bank of America. So its reserves are going to increase by $1,000. Currently, all the money that you give them is sitting in the bank, so that all of their deposit is going to be a reserve. Now, it's important to remember that the assets have to equal the liabilities. So at all times, when we're looking through these T accounts, I mean, the sum of all the assets is going to equal the sum of all the liabilities. So now at this point, in the money creation process, the currency component of the money supply decreases by $1,000 because that $1,000 is no longer in circulation. It's not being held by people anymore. It's being held in the vault at the bank. But the checking deposit component of the money supply increases by $1,000. So at this point, there's no change in the money supply. We're just changing what components of the money supply are. Now, if Bank of America just kept all that cash on hand in reserves, they wouldn't be able to make any money. They'd have no revenue coming in. So they wouldn't be able to afford to upkeep the building, to pay their employees, things like that. So what they're going to do in order to make money is keep 10% of that deposit on hand. So $100 they're going to keep on hand as reserves, and they're going to lend out the rest. So they'll create $900 in a checking account deposit. Let's say for this example, Bank of America lends out $900 to someone to buy a very cheap used car. So Bank of America could give them the $900 in currency, but that's not normally what happens. When we buy a car, typically they increase the borrower's checking account. So we can show this transaction with this new T account. So we now have the reserves of $1,000 plus the loans of $900. And the liabilities, there's $1,000 from the initial deposit. There's also $900 liability from the new deposit that's created. So by making this $900 loan, Bank of America has increased the money supply by $900. So that $1,000 of currency you deposited into your checking account has been turned into $1,900 in checking account deposits. So we've increased the money supply by $900. But it's not going to stay like this for very long because the person who took out that $900 loan didn't do so they could have $900 more in their checking account. They did so they could buy a used car. So let's suppose, for simplicity's sake, that this person, this borrower, buys the car for exactly $900 and pays that by writing a check on their account at Bank of America. So now the seller of that car is going to get $900 and will deposit that check in her bank. So that bank may also be a branch of Bank of America, but in most cities there's going to be a lot of banks. So let's assume it's PNC Bank, just to make it easier for us to distinguish between the two. So once the seller deposits her check, PNC Bank is going to send it to Bank of America to what we call clear the check. When they clear the check, PNC is going to collect the actual $900. So what's going to happen now is that Bank of America has $1,000 or $100 kept in reserves, the 10% of that initial deposit. They're going to loan out $900 to that individual. That $900 loan is going to be an asset for PNC Bank, and they're going to have a deposit. That liability is also going to be $900. So when will it end? I'm not talking about the semester. I'm talking about the money creation process. So after PNC gets that $900, the process is going to begin again, just like it did for Bank of America, and they're going to lend it out to somebody. That'll become deposit somewhere else, with 10% being held as reserve requirements, all the way down. So that initial $1,000, an increase in the checking account from the very beginning step, with a 10% reserve required ratio, is going to result in a total of $10,000 in checking deposits that can be created. So that initial $1,000 causes a large increase in the money supply. Rather than walking through and looking at all the different banks lending out in the entire process, if you want to try to multiply out and figure out what the increase in the money supply is going to be from an initial deposit, we can do some fairly simple math. So rather than adding them all up like we have in the first line, we go down to the second to last line. We take that initial $1,000 deposit, multiplied by 1, divided by the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio is 10%, so 1 divided by 0.10 is going to equal 10. So 1,000 times 10 is $10,000. So very simple math to walk us through to get us the answer, rather than walking through the entire process. So for example, the total increase in deposits from $1,000 is going to be $10,000. So the 10 here is our simple deposit multiplier. The simple deposit multiplier being the ratio of the amount of deposits created by banks to the amount of new reserves. So for a general formula we can use, the simple deposit multiplier equals 1 divided by the required reserve. So again, for examples where the required reserves are 10%, 1 divided by 10% equals 10. So we multiply whatever the initial deposit is, in this case by 10. So if the 10% required reserve ratio that we have in this example, the simple deposit multiplier tells us that a currency deposit is going to be multiplied 10 times for the final increase in currency due to that initial deposit. But in reality, we don't see this. Currency deposits end up being multiplied normally about 2.5 times during normal periods. Obviously, this simplified example abstracts away from the real world, and there's some assumptions we make to simplify so that we're able to work with it. So there's two main differences that come from assumptions that we make in this model. So first, banks may not lend out as much as we predict. So in some cases, they want to keep excess reserves, and this is what we've seen since 2008. Or sometimes they can't find credit-worthy borrowers, so they want to lend out money to people that they think are likely to pay back, but they're unable to find those people that aren't risks. And also, consumers keep some currency out of the banks. That currency that's being held by individuals, kept in their wallet or in their nightstand or under their mattress, that cannot be used as required reserves. So it ends up reducing the multiplier. So in general, we can assume that the real-world deposit multiplier is going to be greater than 1. So basically, what this means, what we should take away from it, is that when banks gain reserves because of deposits, they're going to make new loans, and the money supply is going to expand. And when banks lose reserves because they reduce their loans, the money supply is going to contract. This is the important relationship that we need to know between banks and the money supply they're going to be working with in the next section.